Catherine II of Russia maintained what her courtiers privately called the catalogue. Not a list of military victories or territorial conquests, but something far more personal. 22 official lovers, each one carefully selected, tested, and compensated from the Russian imperial treasury. This wasn't romance. This was an industrial operation of imperial lust, complete with bureaucratic record-keeping and financial documentation that survived in state archives for historians to find centuries later. The system worked like this. When Catherine grew tired of her current favorite, she didn't simply dismiss him. She pensioned him off with estates, serfs, and enough gold to keep him comfortable and silent for life. Grigory Orlov, one of her earliest lovers, received 17,000 serfs as a parting gift. Stanisław Poniatowski, another discarded favorite, was literally made King of Poland as a consolation prize. Catherine was buying silence with kingdoms and fortunes, turning state resources into hush money for her bedroom companions. Court records show that maintaining her lovers cost the Russian treasury more annually than funding the entire imperial navy. She wasn't just having affairs. She was running a financial empire built on sexual patronage, where intimacy with the empress translated directly into political power and generational wealth. But here's where it gets disturbing. Catherine didn't choose these men herself, at least not initially. She employed a woman named Maria Choglokova, and later Countess Bruce, to serve as her official tester. These women would screen potential lovers, examining them physically to ensure they met the empress's standards. They would verify the men's stamina, measure their attributes, and sometimes even engage with them sexually to confirm their suitability before Catherine would grant them an audience. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful woman in Europe had created a sexual quality control department, complete with job descriptions and official duties. Men would line up for the opportunity to be inspected like livestock, knowing that passing the test meant instant wealth and influence. Failing meant humiliation and exile. The appointment process was documented in letters between Catherine and her confidants. She would receive detailed reports about each candidate's performance, physical characteristics, and potential weaknesses. Some men were rejected for being too aggressive, others for lacking proper technique. Catherine treated sex like a military campaign, with reconnaissance, evaluation, and strategic deployment of resources. Her most famous lover, Grigory Potemkin, allegedly passed his test so impressively that Countess Bruce wrote to Catherine with unusual enthusiasm, describing details that would make modern romance novels seem prudish by comparison. Potemkin went on to become not just Catherine's lover but her secret husband, though the marriage was never officially acknowledged. The financial records are even more revealing. Beyond the estates and titles, Catherine spent fortunes on gifts for her lovers. Jewelry worth millions in today's currency, custom-made furniture, even entire palaces constructed as love gifts. When Platon Zubov, her final and youngest lover at age 60, pleased her particularly well, she gave him a palace with 900 rooms. The Russian people were taxed to fund their empress's bedroom rewards program, but the men were just the visible part of Catherine's appetites. The real scandal, the one that would define her legacy and create rumors that persist even today, involved pleasures that even her permissive court found shocking. While Europe's aristocracy whispered about her numerous human lovers, something far stranger was happening in the private quarters of the Winter Palace. Catherine had begun collecting something else. Something that would make her catalogue of 22 men seem almost innocent by comparison. The Winter Palace contained rooms that didn't appear on any official floor plans. Located in a wing accessible only through Catherine's private apartments, these chambers held furniture that would never be displayed in any museum. Craftsmen from France and Italy had been commissioned to create pieces that defied description in polite society, items so explicit that when they were finally discovered after Catherine's death, her successor Paul I ordered them destroyed immediately. But inventories survived. Detailed lists compiled by scandalized servants described chairs designed for sexual positioning, tables with restraint mechanisms built into their legs, and mirrors positioned at angles that would make modern pornography directors nod in appreciation. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a laboratory for imperial experimentation, where the boundaries of pleasure were tested with the same rigor Catherine applied to expanding Russia's borders. The furniture told only part of the story. Catherine had commissioned artists to create what she called her educational collection. Hundreds of erotic paintings, sculptures, and illustrated manuscripts were housed in these secret rooms. But these weren't classical nudes or tasteful Renaissance art. These were explicit instructions, visual manuals depicting every conceivable sexual act, including many that pushed far beyond what even experienced courtesans would consider normal. Foreign ambassadors who somehow learned of these rooms wrote home in coded language, referring to Catherine's unusual collections and her private museums. One French diplomat's letter, decoded years later, described being accidentally shown into the wrong corridor during a palace tour and glimpsing through an open door what he called furnishings that would make Caligula himself recoil in recognition. But the furniture and art were just props. What Catherine actually did in those rooms was far more disturbing. Servants later testified, though always anonymously and often years after her death, about the Empress's specific requirements. She demanded men who could perform for hours, who could match her stamina and exceed it. Those who couldn't were dismissed immediately, their pensions considerably smaller than those who satisfied her completely. One particularly detailed account came from a servant named Vasily, who worked in the private wing for 3 years before requesting a transfer. In his diary, discovered in the 1890s, he described nights when multiple lovers would be rotated through Catherine's chambers, each one expected to perform while the others waited in an adjoining room. The Empress, he wrote, treated intimacy like a military drill, with schedules, performance expectations, and immediate feedback on technique. The psychological toll on these men was enormous. Several of Catherine's favorites suffered what we would now recognize as performance anxiety and depression. Platon Zubov, her final lover, reportedly required laudanum just to maintain the schedule Catherine demanded of him. He was 22 years old when he entered her service. She was 60. The age gap alone would be scandalous, but it was the frequency and intensity of her demands that broke him psychologically. But even this systematic approach to human pleasure wasn't enough. Catherine's appetites had evolved beyond what any man could reasonably provide. Court physicians began noticing unusual requests for treatments and remedies. The Empress was experiencing physical consequences from her lifestyle, but rather than slowing down, she sought medical interventions to continue and intensify her activities. Here's where the historical record becomes genuinely disturbing. Catherine began making specific requests about the palace stables. New horses were to be brought in regularly, always stallions of a particular size and temperament. The head groom received instructions to train these animals in ways that had nothing to do with riding or carriage pulling. Servants noticed that Catherine would visit the stables at odd hours, always alone, always insisting on absolute privacy. The rumors started among the stable workers first, then spread to the palace servants, and eventually reached the wider Russian court. Whispers about what Catherine did during those late-night stable visits became the worst-kept secret in St. Petersburg. But no one dared speak openly. The penalty for spreading rumors about the Empress was exile to Siberia at best, execution at worst. What makes these accounts particularly chilling is their consistency. Multiple independent sources, from different time periods and social classes, all describe the same pattern. The private stable visits, the specially trained horses, the strange equipment that would be installed and removed from certain stalls, the Empress's disheveled appearance when she returned to the palace in the early morning hours. One stable master kept a private journal that survived in his family for generations before being donated to a museum in the 1960s. His entries from 1788 to 1796 are brief but consistent. He records dates when the Empress visited, always noting the same phrase in Latin, Equus pro imperatrice, horse for the Empress. The frequency increased dramatically in Catherine's final years, sometimes occurring 3 or 4 times per week. But Catherine's secret life was about to face its final reckoning. Her body, subjected to decades of extreme physical demands and activities that human anatomy was never designed to withstand, was beginning to fail in ways that even imperial power couldn't hide. The pain that she had been medicating with increasing doses of opium was getting worse, and the damage inside her was approaching catastrophic levels. Something terrible was building inside the Empress's body, something that would soon reveal itself in the most humiliating way possible for a woman who had built her legend on physical pleasure and sexual dominance. The whispers about Catherine's stable visits didn't stay contained within palace walls. By 1790, the rumors had spread throughout European courts, carried by diplomats, merchants, and aristocrats who traveled between capitals. In Paris, London, and Vienna, people spoke in hushed tones about the Russian Empress, who had supposedly crossed a line that even the most debauched monarchs had never approached. The French court, never one to miss an opportunity for scandal, began circulating illustrated pamphlets depicting Catherine in acts with horses. These weren't subtle political cartoons. They were explicit, pornographic images designed to destroy her reputation across Europe. Marie Antoinette herself reportedly kept one of these pamphlets hidden in her private chambers, showing it to close confidants as proof that at least France's queen maintained some dignity compared to Russia's. But here's what makes the story more complex than simple rumor. Multiple servants from different parts of the palace, who had no contact with each other and no reason to coordinate their stories, all reported the same observations. They described hearing animal sounds mixed with human cries coming from the private stables late at night. They talked about finding straw scattered in unusual patterns, about blood on stable floors that couldn't be explained by normal horse care, about the Empress's ladies-in-waiting being sent away on specific nights when Catherine announced she wanted to inspect the horses personally. The head of the Imperial Guard, a man named Alexei Orlov, kept detailed logs of the Empress's movements as part of his security duties. These logs, preserved in Russian state archives, show Catherine making trips to the stables at least twice weekly during her final 8 years. The visits always occurred between midnight and 3 in the morning. They always lasted between 2 and 4 hours, and they always happened when she had dismissed her personal guards, insisting she required privacy for equestrian contemplation. One particularly damning piece of evidence comes from the palace physician, Dr. John Rogerson, a Scottish doctor who served Catherine for the last 20 years of her life. In his private correspondence with colleagues back in Britain, he described treating the Empress for injuries that he carefully avoided specifying in detail. But he did note that these injuries were internal, recurring, and consistent with what he called violent mechanical trauma of an unusual nature. He prescribed increasingly strong pain medications, but noted that Catherine refused to modify the activities that were causing her distress. The most detailed account came from a lady-in-waiting named Maria Perekusikina, who served Catherine from 1789 until the Empress's death. Maria's testimony was given years later to Catherine's grandson, Alexander I, who was investigating the circumstances of his grandmother's death. In this testimony, preserved in sealed imperial documents that weren't opened until the 1920s, Maria described Catherine's obsession with what she called the ultimate conquest. According to Maria, Catherine had become fixated on the idea that she could dominate any creature, human or animal. She viewed her stable visits as the final frontier of power and pleasure, a place where even an empress could experience something forbidden and overwhelming. Maria described finding Catherine after these visits, barely able to walk, her clothing torn, covered in bruises and scratches that she insisted were from falling in the stables. But the physical evidence was harder to dismiss. The palace seamstresses were constantly repairing Catherine's nightclothes, mending tears that seemed inconsistent with any normal activity. The patterns of damage suggested violent pulling and tearing. One seamstress, in testimony given years later, said she had found animal hair embedded in the fabric, dark, coarse hair that matched the palace's Orloff stallions. The stablemasters were offered massive bribes by foreign intelligence services trying to confirm or deny the rumors. Most refused, bound by loyalty or fear. But one, a man named Dmitri, who was dying of consumption, gave a deathbed confession to a priest. He admitted that he had been ordered to train specific horses to tolerate human contact in ways that normal horses would reject violently. He described building special mounting platforms and restraints. He spoke of cleaning up afterwards, of finding evidence that he burned immediately rather than allow anyone else to see. What makes this particularly horrifying is that Catherine appeared to show no shame about her activities. She continued her stable visits even as the rumors spread, even as foreign courts openly mocked her, even as her own advisors begged her to stop for the sake of Russia's reputation. She had become so consumed by her desires that she no longer cared about consequences or dignity. By 1795, Catherine's physical condition had deteriorated noticeably. She moved with difficulty, often holding her abdomen as if in constant pain. She took laudanum multiple times daily, far beyond any medically recommended dose. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she would wake screaming in the night, clutching herself and crying for the pain to stop. But she refused to cease her stable visits. If anything, they became more frequent as her health declined. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had tolerated Catherine's numerous human lovers as the unfortunate weakness of an otherwise capable ruler, began to express serious concerns. The Metropolitan of St. Petersburg requested a private audience with the Empress, intending to address what he carefully called her spiritual crisis. Catherine refused to see him. She had moved beyond earthly judgment, or so she believed. Power and pleasure had merged so completely in her mind that she could no longer distinguish between ruling an empire and satisfying her increasingly dangerous appetites. What Catherine didn't realize was that her body was keeping a tally of every excess, every injury, every violent encounter. Internal damage was accumulating faster than even opium could mask. Her organs were failing in ways that 18th century medicine couldn't understand or treat. And the final reckoning was approaching faster than anyone, including the Empress herself, could have imagined. By November 1796, Catherine II was 67 years old and barely recognizable as the vibrant woman who had seized the Russian throne 34 years earlier. Her weight had ballooned to nearly 250 pounds. Her face was bloated from constant pain medication, and she moved through the palace like a wounded animal, shuffling from room to room with the assistance of 2 attendants who had to practically carry her when she insisted on making her increasingly rare stable visits. Court physicians documented her decline with growing alarm. Dr. Rogerson's medical notes describe a patient suffering from what he termed a general systemic collapse. Catherine experienced chronic abdominal pain so severe that she often couldn't stand upright. She suffered from recurring infections that no amount of bloodletting or herbal remedies could cure. Her skin had taken on a grayish tint, and she frequently vomited after meals, unable to keep down anything but weak tea and bread. But the most disturbing aspect of her condition was what the doctors couldn't see. Internal examinations, as limited as they were in the 18th century, suggested massive damage to her reproductive organs and surrounding tissues. Dr. Rogerson noted in a letter to a colleague that the Empress's internal structures felt utterly destroyed, as if subjected to repeated violent assault over many years. He suspected what he called catastrophic tearing, but couldn't perform a thorough examination without Catherine's cooperation, which she absolutely refused to provide. The pain medications became Catherine's only comfort. She consumed laudanum like water, taking doses that would have killed a normal person. Her personal pharmacist kept detailed records of her consumption, and the numbers are staggering. In her final year, Catherine went through enough opium-based medicine to supply a small hospital. The drug kept her functional, but it also clouded her judgment and intensified her paranoia about appearing weak. Here's where the tragedy becomes almost unbearable. Catherine knew she was dying. Her private letters from this period, written to Platon Zubov in handwriting that deteriorated from elegant script to barely legible scrawl, reveal a woman terrified of her approaching end, but unable to stop the behaviors that were killing her. She wrote about feeling torn apart from within, about pain that felt like hot knives in my belly, about bleeding that wouldn't stop no matter how much she rested. Yet she continued her stable visits. Even as her body was literally falling apart, she insisted on maintaining the routine that had defined her final years. The stablemasters later testified that they had to construct special steps and supports to help the Empress mount the platforms she used. They described her gasping for breath, crying out in pain, even as she insisted they continue preparing the horses for her visits. It was as if she believed that stopping would mean admitting defeat, and Catherine had spent her entire life refusing to surrender to anything or anyone. The physical toll was documented by those around her. Her ladies-in-waiting described finding blood on her undergarments after stable visits, quantities that suggested serious internal injuries. They noticed her walking with an increasingly unnatural gait, as if every step caused agony. She began wearing loose, flowing robes instead of the structured court dresses she had favored, unable to tolerate anything pressing against her damaged body. But Catherine's deterioration wasn't just physical. Her mental state was unraveling as well. The combination of chronic pain, constant medication, and the knowledge that her body was betraying her created a psychological spiral. She became paranoid, convinced that her doctors were plotting to declare her insane and unfit to rule. She accused her attendants of gossiping about her condition, which they absolutely were, but with good reason. She alternated between moments of lucidity, where she tried to conduct state business, and periods of complete detachment, where she would stare at nothing, lost in a fog of pain and drugs. Her son Paul, who despised her and was waiting eagerly for his chance to rule, began making preparations for her death even as she still sat on the throne. He spread his own rumors about his mother's degeneracy, adding embellishments to the stable stories that made them even more grotesque than the reality. Paul wanted to ensure that when Catherine died, her reputation would die with her, making his own reign look virtuous by comparison. The final months of 1796 were a countdown to catastrophe. Catherine's physicians knew she was dying, but couldn't determine the exact cause beyond general organ failure. The truth was that her body had sustained so much damage over so many years that it simply couldn't continue functioning. The internal injuries, the infections, the strain of obesity, the effects of decades of pain medication, all of it was converging toward an inevitable conclusion. On November 5, 1796, Catherine made what would be her final visit to the stables. Servants later reported that she could barely walk, that she had to be carried most of the way. She spent less than an hour there, far shorter than her usual visits. And when she returned to the palace, she was pale, shaking, and holding her abdomen with both hands. She went straight to her private chambers and refused to see anyone except her physicians. Dr. Rogerson examined her and found her condition had deteriorated dramatically. She was bleeding internally, he could tell that much, but he had no way to stop it or even fully understand where the bleeding was coming from. He gave her massive doses of laudanum to control the pain and ordered her to bed rest, knowing even as he did so that it was far too late for such measures to make any difference. Catherine spent the next 11 days in and out of consciousness, experiencing periods of clarity, followed by long stretches of delirious rambling. She spoke about horses, about power, about pleasure, about refusing to be weak, even as her body disintegrated around her. Her attendants recorded these utterances, creating a disturbing record of a mind unraveling in the face of approaching death. But Catherine's final humiliation was still to come. The manner of her death would be so shocking, so grotesque, that it would overshadow even the scandals of her life. And what the physicians would discover when they examined her body would confirm the darkest rumors while revealing horrors that no one had imagined. The Empress, who had ruled through pleasure and pain, was about to experience one final, terrible surrender that she couldn't control or dominate. And this time, there would be witnesses to document every degrading detail. November 16th, 1796, started like any other morning in the Winter Palace. Catherine rose early, despite her declining health, determined to maintain at least the appearance of normalcy. She dressed with the help of her ladies-in-waiting, took her morning dose of laudanum, and insisted on drinking her usual cup of strong coffee. She even managed to sign a few documents that had been waiting for her attention, though her signature was barely legible. Around 9 in the morning, Catherine announced she needed to use her private water closet. This wasn't unusual. The Empress often spent extended periods there, partly due to her digestive issues, and partly because it was one of the few places she could be truly alone. Her attendants helped her to the small room adjacent to her bedchamber and waited outside as protocol required. What happened next has been pieced together from the testimony of servants who were nearby and the physical evidence discovered later. Around 9:15, one of the ladies in waiting heard a sound she described as something heavy falling. Then silence. She called out to the Empress but received no response. Protocol demanded that she wait for Catherine to emerge on her own, but after several minutes of complete silence, she became alarmed and knocked on the door. Still nothing. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, the lady in waiting made the decision to enter without permission. What she found would become one of the most documented moments in Russian imperial history, though most accounts were heavily censored or altered to protect Catherine's legacy. The Empress was on the floor, collapsed between the water closet and the wall. She was unconscious, her face purple, her breathing labored and irregular. But what horrified the servant most was the blood. Catherine was lying in a spreading pool of it, seeping from under her nightgown and staining the floor beneath her. The smell in the small room was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, feces, and something else that the servant couldn't identify, but described as rotten and animal-like. The servant screamed for help. Within minutes, the room was filled with attendants, physicians, and eventually members of the Imperial Guard. They carefully moved Catherine from the water closet to her bed, but the Empress never regained consciousness. Dr. Rogerson examined her and found a situation far worse than he had feared. Catherine had suffered what modern medicine would recognize as a massive stroke, but that wasn't what was killing her. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Dr. Rogerson could see blood soaking through the sheets beneath her, far more than should have been possible from any normal internal injury. When he examined her more closely, with the help of other physicians who had been summoned, they discovered that the Empress was hemorrhaging from multiple sites simultaneously. The damage was internal, extensive, and completely untreatable by 18th century medical standards. For the next 36 hours, Catherine lay dying in her bed while the entire Russian court held its breath. Messengers were sent to notify Paul that his mother was dying. Foreign ambassadors were informed that the Empress was gravely ill. The Orthodox Church prepared for the inevitable, sending priests to administer last rites, even though Catherine remained unconscious and couldn't receive them properly. During this time, Dr. Rogerson and his team tried everything they knew to stop the bleeding and revive the Empress. They administered more opium, hoping to ease what must have been terrible pain even in her unconscious state. They tried bloodletting, the standard treatment for almost everything at the time, which only made her condition worse. They applied poultices, gave her various herbal mixtures through a tube, even attempted to cauterize what they suspected were internal wounds, though they had no way to reach them. Nothing worked. Catherine's pulse grew weaker, her breathing more shallow. The blood continued to seep from her body, staining the imperial bed sheets and dripping onto the floor despite the servants' best efforts to contain it. The smell in the room became so overwhelming that attendants had to rotate shifts, taking breaks to go outside and breathe fresh air before returning to their dying Empress. On the evening of November 17th, at approximately 9:45 p.m., Catherine II of Russia took her final breath. She died without regaining consciousness, without any final words or gestures, without any dignity in her final moments. The woman who had ruled one of the world's largest empires for more than 3 decades died lying in her own blood and waste, surrounded by horrified servants and physicians who had been powerless to save her. But the official announcement wouldn't come until the next morning. Paul insisted on seeing his mother's body before any public statement was made, and what he demanded next would reveal secrets that Catherine's doctors had suspected but never confirmed. He ordered a complete autopsy, something rarely performed on royalty, claiming he needed to understand what had killed his mother to ensure it wasn't poison or foul play. The real reason was far more sinister. Paul wanted proof of his mother's degeneracy. He wanted documentation of her excesses. He wanted to destroy whatever remained of Catherine's reputation by exposing the physical evidence of her lifestyle. And the physicians who performed the autopsy would give him exactly what he wanted, though even Paul would be shocked by what they discovered inside the Empress's ravaged body. The autopsy of Catherine II was performed on November 18, 1796, less than 12 hours after her death. Dr. Rogerson led the examination, assisted by 2 other court physicians and several medical students who had been ordered to document everything in excruciating detail. Paul personally attended the first hour of the procedure, wanting to witness the exposure of his mother's secrets. What they found exceeded everyone's worst expectations. When the physicians opened Catherine's abdominal cavity, they were hit with a smell so putrid that several observers had to leave the room immediately. The stench was described as a combination of gangrene, feces, and decomposing flesh. One medical student vomited directly onto the floor and had to be escorted out. The internal organs told a story of systematic destruction. Catherine's uterus was barely recognizable as a human organ. It was massively enlarged, filled with pus, and showed signs of multiple tears that had healed badly over the years. The tissue was necrotic in several places, literally rotting while she was still alive. Dr. Rogerson documented tears that extended through the uterine wall into the surrounding cavity, injuries that should have killed her years earlier, but had somehow been survived through sheer stubborn will and constant pain medication. But the uterus wasn't the worst of it. Her bladder was perforated in 3 separate locations, explaining the recurring infections and blood in her urine that had plagued her final years. Her intestines showed signs of repeated trauma and tearing, with scar tissue so extensive that it was surprising she could digest food at all. The physicians found foreign matter in her abdominal cavity, material that they initially couldn't identify, but that appeared to be fragments of wood and straw embedded in her organs. The reproductive organs were the most horrifying discovery. Catherine's vaginal canal was so severely damaged that Dr. Rogerson's report, preserved in Russian medical archives, described it as more resembling a wound than a natural structure. The tissue was torn in multiple directions, with scar tissue that suggested repeated violent trauma over many years. The cervix was almost completely destroyed. The surrounding muscles and ligaments were stretched and torn beyond any possibility of normal function. Most damning of all was what they found in the deepest internal tears. Coarse dark hair, matching samples taken from the Orloff stallions in the imperial stables. The physicians documented this finding carefully, knowing it would confirm the rumors that had haunted Catherine for years. Paul ordered this detail emphasized in the report, ensuring that future historians would know exactly what his mother had been doing in those late-night stable visits. The damage extended beyond the reproductive system. Catherine's lower spine showed signs of severe trauma, with several vertebrae fractured and improperly healed. Her pelvic bones were cracked in multiple places. Her kidneys were failing. Her liver was cirrhotic from years of heavy drinking in addition to her other excesses. And her heart was enlarged and struggling, showing signs of having operated under extreme stress for years. Dr. Rogerson's final conclusion, written in careful medical Latin to obscure its full meaning from casual readers, stated that Catherine had died from massive internal hemorrhaging resulting from catastrophic structural failure of the reproductive and digestive organs consistent with repeated violent trauma of an extreme and unnatural nature. In simpler terms, her body had been so thoroughly destroyed by decades of abuse that it simply gave out, bleeding internally from multiple sites until she died. The physicians estimated that Catherine had been living with fatal injuries for at least the final 5 years of her life. Only massive doses of opium and her seemingly superhuman tolerance for pain had allowed her to continue functioning. Any normal person would have died years earlier. But Catherine's will to maintain her lifestyle, to refuse to acknowledge weakness or limitation, had kept her going long past the point where her body should have surrendered. Paul ordered that most of the autopsy report be sealed, though he made sure selected details leaked to foreign courts. He wanted the world to know that his mother had been a sexual deviant who had literally destroyed herself through her appetites, but he also wanted to maintain enough royal dignity to avoid making Russia itself look weak or foolish. The official cause of death was listed simply as apoplexy, a stroke, which was technically true but woefully incomplete. Catherine's body was prepared for a state funeral with elaborate embalming procedures designed to mask the smell of her decomposing organs. She was dressed in her coronation robes and displayed in an open casket for 3 days, while thousands of Russian subjects filed past to pay their respects to their dead empress. But those who prepared her body knew the truth. The embalmers had to work quickly because Catherine's corpse was deteriorating faster than normal due to the internal infections that had been ravaging her body even before death. They used massive amounts of perfume and preserving chemicals to mask the smell. They packed her abdominal cavity with aromatic herbs. They sealed her internal organs in lead containers that were buried separately from her body, a detail that was kept quiet but documented in church records. Catherine II was buried with full imperial honors in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, laid to rest among Russia's emperors and empresses. The public mourned their powerful ruler who had expanded Russia's territory and strengthened its position in Europe. They remembered her as Catherine the Great, enlightened despot and military genius. But the autopsy report told a different story. It revealed a woman so consumed by her own appetites that she had literally destroyed herself from the inside out. A ruler so obsessed with dominating everything and everyone that she had refused to acknowledge limitations, even as her own body betrayed her. An empress who had commanded armies and nations but couldn't control the desires that were killing her. The irony is almost unbearable. Catherine spent her entire life accumulating power, conquering territories, dominating men and nations. She believed herself above normal human constraints, above judgment, above consequence. But in the end, she was conquered by the most basic fact of existence. The human body has limits. Push it far enough, damage it thoroughly enough, and it will fail regardless of how much power you hold or how much pain you're willing to endure. The woman who had collected lovers like trophies, who had maintained a catalogue of sexual conquests, who had pushed beyond every boundary of acceptable behavior, died alone in a pool of her own blood after her body finally surrendered to decades of abuse. The empress who had dominated Europe died in the most humiliating way possible, revealing to history that beneath all the power and glory was just flesh and blood, and that flesh can only take so much before it fails catastrophically. Catherine the Great's legacy is complex. She was undeniably a brilliant ruler who expanded Russia and patronized the arts and sciences. But she was also a woman who literally destroyed herself through uncontrolled appetites, who pushed her own body past the point of no return in pursuit of pleasures that ultimately killed her. The autopsy report stands as a permanent reminder that power has limits, that the human body will eventually demand payment for every excess, and that even empresses must ultimately surrender to biology and death. In the end, Catherine's story is less about sex or scandal, and more about the terrible price of believing yourself above the laws of nature. She dominated men, nations, and empires, but she couldn't dominate her own mortality, and her death was far more degrading than anything she inflicted on others during her reign.